I'd like to take a few moments to thank some of the members of the audience today who have made this project possible. I am grateful to the Phi Beta Kappa Wit and Wisdom Committee, Dr. Gray, Dr. Stein, and Dr. Westercott. I'd also like to thank Laurie McFadden for her incredible work in the archives. And if there are any of my patients in the audience today, I'd like to thank you for allowing me to be there for you during your vulnerable times. And lastly, I'd like to thank my friends and family at the A.E. Crandall Hook and Ladder Company who have suctioned airways, fought the ER over ambulance pillow ownership, and who have wept and laughed alongside me. I would trust you with my life any day. All right, here goes. The first time I gave CPR, I did not have time to watch a YouTube tutorial for it. In fact, like most other CPR performers, I stumbled into the situation somewhat accidentally. I should also mention that, somewhat alarmingly, watching YouTube tutorials in the medical field is like porn. Everyone does it, and no one wants to talk about it. This particular CPR call happened as most CPR calls do, on an unremarkable afternoon in an unremarkable home. Yet the unremarkable event of a human life ending is anything but unremarkable. And this juxtaposition of the ordinary and extraordinary is a philosophical exercise that EMTs are continuously confronted with. Simply put, we are strangers walking into people's life-changing events. Or, like Mother Teresa put it, we, the willing, led by the unknowing, are doing the impossible. We have done so much with so little for so long that we are now qualified to do anything with nothing. This was not the first time I had witnessed the ending of a life. A few months prior to this particular incident, I had watched my father meet his demise to an unforgiving and unrelenting cancer, which had latched onto his pancreas and anything else it could feed upon. At the time of his diagnosis, I was a sophomore in college whose life experience up to this point ended up with a good few stories, which all started with unfortunate encounters with dollar store vodka bought with a friend's fake ID, and ended with sorry tales of disastrous and somewhat miraculous walks back to our dorm rooms. Death, as far as I was concerned, was something that happened to other people, or was something that we discussed in my introduction to philosophy class. I was too busy living to think about it outside of a romanticized and fictionalized form. Death had no face, and death had no name. Death had no number, and death would not call. Whilst I understood the gravity of the concept, it was its finality and irreversibility that I struggled to conceptualize. It took my father's death for me to understand the latter. During one of his seemingly interminable chemotherapy sessions, long enough for me to have leafed through all the uninteresting magazines that promised 7 hot tips to make him never forget you, or bikini body in 4 moves and 5 minutes, I observed an older man get up from his reclining chair. With a considerable amount of effort, this man untangled himself from the web of wires and tubes attached to him. He stood up and shuffled to the outside area, still connected to the bags of chemicals that assured hope, but could not promise it. Once outside, he promptly lit a cigarette and wallowed in the joy the thick smoke brought him. It's the absurdity of this moment, a chemotherapy patient smoking during his treatment, that is an image that has remained embedded in my brain, wedged between the witness of grief and the indescribable blandness of the unexplainable. 3 months later, my father asked me to discharge him from hospital and died at home, in his bed, the next evening. Death had finally arrived, taking the time to leave her shoes at the front door. When you are grieving, you need to find a project. While the prospect of a book club or an outdoor appreciation group seemed appealing, I decided on joining the A.E. Crandall Hook and Ladder Company. I'm not sure what kind of logic, or lack thereof, compelled me to join a fire and EMS company as grief work, but I did. Perhaps I was emboldened by the loss of my father, simultaneously fearing all but feeling nothing, or fearing nothing and feeling all. In any case, I applied for membership, no one objected, and I became a volunteer. A note about my fire department. A.E. Crandall Hook and Ladder Company is no ordinary village fire department. Jean Lang, a well-respected longtime historian and cultivator of all things Alfred, New York, describes A.E. Crandall's remarkable history in her research. It has been a good many years since the volunteer firefighters of Alfred, New York, sat on coffin boxes to hold their meetings on the second floor of Phil Place's undertaker's establishment. The company was formed in February of 1887. The criteria for membership read as follows: any person of at least 18 years of age who is physically fit, of good character, is a resident of the town of Alfred, or is employed in the village, shall be eligible for membership. In November of 1887, the firefighters decided to take steps to find a suitable home for their company. One can only imagine that the firefighters had grown tired of talks of heroic attempts to save land and lives amidst this macabre assembly hall. It was bad marketing, or perhaps bad luck, to house the fire department in an undertaking establishment. In July of 1889, a plot of land bought from the estate of Elisha Potter on West University Street was chosen as the new and perhaps more welcoming home of the fire department. The whole thing cost $250, $50 down payment, and another $50 annual payment until the balance was paid. True to the nature of its purpose, the fire hall was built almost entirely by volunteers. Lang describes this accomplishment as labor with men working before breakfast, after supper, and all night to complete the structure that is still in use. According to Lang, the hall became the center of social gatherings for the village and served as a clubroom with pool table, a rifle range, a cinema in 1913, and a cabbage storage room at various points in history. 1951 saw the installation of the modern telephone system in the homes and workplaces of volunteers to respond to fires and medical calls. This ensured 24-hour coverage for the village. The 1960s brought about the wild winds of feminism, and in 1968, an internal memo recommended that it was advisable for the woman answering the fire hall's phone and the one or two nurses serving the company to be addressed as firemen. It is important to note that these women were not secretaries. They were, quite literally, women answering the call of duty from the newly installed telephone lines, which, as Becky Prophet points out, arguably traumatized young families around the village, unfortunate enough to live with an EMT. Dr. Nancy Furlong, Alfred's first assistant fire chief and one of New York State's first women to receive the title of chief, recently recalled an interaction between a young child and her EMT mother in the village during the telephone era of emergencies. "Mama, the telephone is ringing. God is on the line for you." Confused, the mother asked her daughter, "What on earth are you talking about?" And the little girl replied, "Well, whenever you pick up the telephone, you say, 'Oh, God.'" Things have changed at A.E. Crandall. Telephones have been replaced by radios and pagers. We no longer store cabbage in the hall, and women have voting rights. Yet the spirit of volunteerism remains unchanged. Rumor has it that we are the ambulance crew in the country with the most doctors on board. Sadly, we only have one actual doctor with an MD, and he serves as our medical director, an act of valiance as his medical license depends on what one hopes to be the good judgment and adherence to protocols of the EMTs on board. The rest of the doctors on the crew are humble academics, although their presence on board makes for wonderful conversation. On any given night, there is a good chance that I'm on call with a global expert on microwaves, the electromagnetic type, a literature professor or two, and if chance permits it, the ambulance is driven by a professor emeritus of chemistry or a former Scottish nurse who worked in Botswana. True to Alfred, we have our fair share of engineers, and when watching them set up an IV, one cannot help but wonder if they are imagining laying out intricate electrical circuits in their head. The vast array of professional backgrounds means that every EMT approaches the medical emergency differently. To the engineer, death is the irreversible failure of the parts of the machine. To the theatre professor, death is the fall of the curtain after the last act of a tragicomedy. Almost all EMTs have transformed into philosophers from their experiences, regardless of their scientific or cultural denomination. The great French philosopher Michel de Montaigne, who would certainly have benefited from having EMTs around in Renaissance France for his incessant kidney stones, quoting Plato, wrote that to study philosophy is to learn to die. It is important to note here that anyone who has had an unfortunate run-in with kidney stones may be inclined to think that Montaigne's inspiration for this worldview lay in his medical affliction. Kidney stone survivor or not, Montaigne's philosophy resonates true with anyone who has been confronted with the subject of mortality. Every single ride on the ambulance is unavoidably an exercise in philosophy. To the EMT, a call is a lesson in power and powerlessness, in fairness or in lack thereof. One can imagine that to the conscious patient, the ride in the ambulance is also a powerful exercise. One of the most profound moments I have experienced on board the ambulance was simply the act of watching a terminally ill patient see their own reflection in the ambulance door en route to a hospital, and the look on their weathered face suggested that they wondered, as I did, if not now, how many more? Membership for this danse macabre requires a sense of humor, although an EMT's definition of what is humorous may differ from our non-EMT counterparts. Recently, a dear friend and fellow EMT described an incident that she had encountered during an ambulance call to a motor vehicle accident. The accident had taken place in the early hours of the morning, and the roads to Alfred lay under a blanket of ice and darkness. With eyelids dense with fatigue, the driver of the vehicle had simply hit a barrier and sent the car in a spiral. Thankfully, the passengers of the car, a mother and her young daughters, were shaken but unharmed. The responding crew breathed a sigh of relief and were ready to discharge the family after evaluating them, when a state trooper walked over with what appeared to be a baby cradled in his arms. Horrified that they had missed an infant during the scene evaluation, the crew hung their heads in shame and feared for the worst. It was only upon closer inspection that the crew realized that the trooper was simply walking over with a doll for the little girls to play in the car with. The crew had to check their own blood pressures after that call. On Saturday nights, the trusted and venerable Alfred 801 ambulance transforms itself into the drunk tank, servicing college students who have had unfortunate run-ins with liquor. The Saturday night crew is well aware of this fact when they sign up for slots and is happy to tumble from their slumber to care for such patients. Patients usually fall into one of two categories: passed out cold, completely unaware of the fact that they are hurtling into the night towards the ER, or highly intoxicated and equally as energetic. Regardless, the crew is there to assist. On such a night, the ambulance was the one who experienced an unfortunate run-in, this time with a deer. The impact caused significant damage to the brakes of the rig, and Alfred 801 was left stranded in the night, somewhere between Alfred and Hornell, with a sound asleep, intoxicated patient. The crew waited in the cold for a second ambulance to take the relay, and the baton of healthcare was passed on to a competent, although entirely different crew. The patient never awoke during this transfer. And one can imagine that all they remembered from their wild ambulance ride was the colossal hangover the next day. Here's another one for comic relief, since we are talking about death and dying. My friend and fellow ambulance crew member, who shall remain nameless as she may or may not be present in the audience today, recently forgot her underwear at the scene of an incident. Let me finish. Flustered that her pager had set off the tones and interrupted her sleep at an ungodly hour, this brave soul and EMT grabbed on a pair of old pants and quickly slid into them as she hurried out the door to address the emergency in question. As she was providing quality medical attention to the patient, she looked down to the ground and noticed a lacy piece of material which looked an awful lot like her underwear. Upon closer inspection, she realized that it was, in fact, her underwear. And that this pair of panties had emerged from their hiding place in this old pair of pants. With cat-like reflexes, she grabbed her dignity off the floor and stuck it in a much more secure hiding spot. Luckily for her, no one seemed to have noticed, or they were simply too polite to point out her indiscretion. These humorous tales provide necessary relief from the series of awful calls that EMTs have to endure. Whilst it is easy to find material for comic relief, it is equally as difficult to forget the tragedies. The metallic scent of blood, the fatal lulling of the eyes, the grieving families are unforgettable, but arguably their predictable nature makes them easier to handle and emotionally digest. The unpredictable variables at the scenes are the ones that surprise us and linger long after the call has ended. It is the whimpering family dog, the kindergarten drawing signed Amy plastered on the fridge, or the family vacation photo in Myrtle Beach circa 2012 that haunt us. Never look around during a code remains a piece of advice passed on to new EMTs by veterans in the field. And yet, how can we not? The very nature of our position requires us to enter into these personal spaces at the worst of times. No one starts their day expecting to call 911. Beds remain unmade, dishes fester in the sink, and homes and the lives lived inside them are left exposed for us intruders to see. The call, originally dispatched as a 53-year-old male with chest pain, slowly becomes Richard, a father of 3, whose wedding photos were taken by a lake, and judging by the plate of food by the bed, did not like tomatoes on his sandwich. The impersonal emergencies are difficult to deal with, too. Recently, I attended a psychology conference in Philadelphia with the wonderful Dr. Danielle Gagné, who is a walking example of the Holy Trinity, as she serves as the psychology division chair, is a member of A.E. Crandall Hook and Ladder, and somehow manages to be my academic advisor on top of that. Some people have emotional support animals. Others cry in Dr. Gagné's office while eating Girl Scout cookies. Dr. Gagné also manages to find the time to teach the class Death and Dying. On the morning of the conference, after a mandatory pit stop at Dunkin' Donuts, Dr. Gagné, myself, and a few of my classmates walked over to the convention center. I had an extra meal to share and was on the lookout for a homeless person that I could give it to. A man was lying on the floor and caught my attention, and I turned to my friend and told her that something just didn't look right, and that my gut feeling told me that there was something decidedly off about the scene. And sure enough, as I crossed the road, I noticed that he was not breathing, and I could not feel his pulse either. 911 was dialed, and we waited for an ambulance to arrive. During this time, my classmates received the extra credit they never asked for, Death and Dying, the practical. Dr. Gagné chased down this man's jacket in an attempt to find a form of ID so that we or someone would know who he was. And we never found out, and the EMTs that responded to this call seemed apathetic to the fact that this person had died an anonymous death. Perhaps this is what happens when you see these kinds of events on a daily basis. Or they were simply living by the 2 rules of EMS. Rule number 1, people die. Rule number 2, sometimes you cannot do anything about rule number 1. Perhaps these Philly EMTs had made an addition to the rules. Rule number 3, if you feel too much, you won't feel anything anymore. EMTs are tired people with increased chances of work injuries and repeated exposure to traumatic events. If pay is involved, it is usually not a financially rewarding gig in comparison to the physical and emotional toll that the work demands. Unsurprisingly, the turnover rate is pretty high and is usually preceded by a call that was one too many. Yet, if you speak to most active EMTs, they will talk about their experience on board these ice cream trucks of death as spiritual experiences on par with going to Burning Man or a 3-day juice fast after a month at SoulCycle. There is magic to be found on board the chaos, and oftentimes there is no chaos to be found on board. The fabric of these calls is simply human connection. In what other context is a perfect stranger able to ask another about their most intimate concerns within minutes? Within minutes of interacting with a patient, we will know when the last meal was, the pain level, their medical history, their current medications, and their anxieties. At its core, emergency medical services is an act of empathy and a response to a cry for help. Behind every screech from the pager, there's usually a screeching family member on the other side of dispatch. We walk in as complete strangers and meet people during their life-changing events. Alfred adds another element to this dynamic by allowing chance to dictate whether or not we will recognize people at the scene. My favorite recollection of such event involves a trek down to GJ's for an intoxicated patient in the bathroom. Upon exiting the bathroom to fetch something from the ambulance, I bumped into a couple of friends who thought I was there on my own accord and proceeded to pull me onto the dance floor. As one does in such a refined establishment. I had to kindly decline their invitation to dance and to explain that I was in fact on a call and needed to be sober for the occasion. To step onto the ambulance is to be confronted with the inevitable and unavoidable topic of mortality. In this profession, one starts to think in terms of the worst-case scenario. While we hope for the best, we're prepared for the worst. And often, the worst comes down to imagining our own demises. We wonder what would happen if we experienced a catastrophic medical emergency and whether we would understand what was happening to us. Would we, as emergency medical personnel, understand that our slurred speech and uncoordinated movements were a sign of a catastrophic and irreversible cerebrovascular hemorrhage? One wonders then, would we bother to call 911? What would be the last words to hear? The last sight to see? Would we be alone in this? Would the ambulance arrive, lights and sirens, just in time for us to see the crew gather around us to hear the paramedic trainee exclaim, "Let me do the endotracheal tube." On certain days, one also wonders why we do this. Do we seek to stop the world from bleeding because that is all we can do to stop our own? Is our desire to help a manifestation of a desire to be helped? And then the question is asked, how can we do this? And for a few moments, we wonder the same thing. For now and for the near future, the answer remains the same. How can we not? Thank you.